Good evening, everyone. If we can please have you take your seats, we will begin shortly. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Please take a seat and we will begin momentarily. And you are more than welcome to move up to the front rows. That is totally okay. As we get started, if anyone has a hard time hearing, those of you in the back, feel free to move forward. We won't bite, we promise. Okay, good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Ariella Mason, and I am our Special Collections Coordinator for our Heritage Center and our Government Docs section at the Fresno County Public Library. In today's event, we will be learning about the World War II experience as it was seen in Fresno County. This is specifically going to be focused on the Japanese immigrants, Issei, and Japanese Americans, often called Nisei, as they were forced to leave the West Coast. Sorry. Our event will include a presentation by our speaker, De La Queda, and then we will have, after that, a brief Q&A session. After that, we then invite everyone to please join us across the hall. There is a wonderful exhibit of art that has been brought to us by Mark Patterson and the students of McLean High School. It also took the staff of Temple Beth Israel lots of work to put in, so please go and enjoy that, and that highlights the history of the internment camps as well. And there's also snacks that are provided to us by the United Japanese Christian Church. So. We would also like to thank everyone who made this happen. This program happened in coordination with the Americans in the Holocaust, a traveling exhibition for libraries, made possible by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the American Library Association, the American Friends Service Committee, the Armenian Museum of Fresno, Avenues for Change, the Holocaust and Genocide Education, which I did not fix, I'm sorry, the Fresno Buddhist Temple, Fresno County Library, Fresno State University, Mark Patterson at the McLean Art Venture Academy, the Pan Valley Institute, Temple Beth Israel, and the United Japanese Christian Church. So, yay. And then on to our gracious speaker. Our speaker today will be Mr. Ikeda. Mr. Ikeda has served as a judge of the Superior Court of the County of Fresno, the district governor and national legal counsel for the Japanese American Citizens League, which is the oldest and largest Asian American human and civil rights organization in America, as well as the honorary consul of Japan in Fresno. He currently serves as a member of the advisory board of the National Veterans Network, which preserves the history and educates the public on the accomplishments of the Japanese American soldiers during World War II. He also serves as the chair of the committees that created the memorials at the sites of the Fresno and Pinedale Assembly Centers, temporary internment sites for Japanese Americans during World War II, and the exhibit at the Fresno County Historical Museum entitled Japanese Americans in the San Joaquin Valley. And with that, I will hand the mic over to Mr. Ikeda.
Good evening. I'm scheduled for a 35-minute talk. I just started the timer, and I will stop after 35 minutes unless you consent for a little longer presentation. I've got quite a bit of material to go over, but I'll try to be mindful of your schedules. I want to thank Ariella for that kind introduction and the Fresno County Library staff for working with me regarding this presentation. And I want to thank Temple Beth Israel for hosting this event. Thank you very much, Rabbi, and the rest of the folks here. Really appreciate your courtesy. We do have a celebrity in our midst. I'd like to introduce Ray Hotoda to stand up. Ray, I'm embarrassing her. As most of you know, Ray is the conductor of the Fresno Philharmonic Orchestra, and they have a performance coming up Saturday, November 18th, this Saturday at 7:30 p.m. at the Sheboygan Theater at Buchanan High School, as well as Sunday at 3 p.m. at the same site. So please consider attending. And today in the mail, I just received notice of a program, Home for the Holidays, that Ray is going to be conducting and I believe also playing piano. Okay, I've heard Ray play in a personal performance at Bernie and Marion Carrion's home, And I thank Bernie for being here. He is one of a number of backgammon players at the Fresno Tableau or Backgammon Club. I also see Mark Antronikian, who just sponsored a backgammon tournament at St. Paul's Armenian Church. And Ed Darden, I see, who's part of our group as well. Thank you, folks, for being here. Now I've already spent 2.5 minutes, so I better move on. I want to thank the Fresno County Library for sponsoring the Americans and the Holocaust exhibit on display at the main library. I've been there a couple times now. And one of the questions is, what more could have been done? And it's really a question for the U.S. and for Americans in consideration to providing visas, immigration status, and refuge for the Jews escaping the Holocaust. And if you read the materials, it looks like we could have done a lot more. There's also a storyboard on the Japanese American experience. And the question is, citizens or enemies? So Japanese Americans during World War II were considered suspect as possible saboteurs or spies for the Japanese Empire, which they were not. There were no cases of espionage or sabotage by any Japanese Americans, either on the West Coast or Hawaii. This is sort of a timely occasion for me to make a few comments. First of all, Veterans Day was November 10th, 4 days ago. And as mentioned, I'm on the National Veterans Network, which tries to educate the public about the exploits of the Japanese American soldiers of World War II and how they fought 2 wars, prejudice at home, where their families were interned, and fighting for freedom abroad. So if you just try to imagine people volunteering from American concentration camps to fight for freedom abroad while their own families were imprisoned here at home. And I should say something about terminology. I will use certain terms interchangeably. Internment is sort of the normal terminology for the Japanese American internment, exclusion from the West Coast, internment in war relocation centers. They were actually concentration camps. That's not to be confused with the Nazi death camps that the Jews experienced during World War II, but Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes, kept in guarded areas called assembly centers initially and war relocation centers after that. But they were concentration camps, and that's not a chapter that America is proud of. I would like to mention the Irecho project at the Japanese American National Museum. There's documentation of those who were interned. The numbers have varied over time, but there were over 125,000 Japanese Americans interned during World War II. Most of them came from Washington, Oregon, California, and Arizona. In Hawaii, there was no large-scale internment, but there were over a dozen detention sites, and over 8,000 Japanese Americans were held at the Honolulu War Relocation Center. The internment is justified in part by an executive order issued by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Executive Order number 9066, which authorized the Secretary of War and his designees to exclude any and all persons from designated military zones. General John L. DeWitt was the commander of the Western Defense Command and had jurisdiction over exclusion and ultimately internment of Japanese Americans. I think it's fair to say that he was a racist. The orders were never applied to Germans or Italians in a wholesale way. And he did say in a congressional testimony, a Jap is a Jap, and that the Japanese race is an enemy race, even with the reference to American citizens of Japanese ancestry who were born here. Pursuant to the executive order, one of the early orders were for curfew and travel restrictions. That was from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. and 5-mile radius of one's home. So let me start with my mom and dad, who were courting back in 1941, 1942. So with these orders, my dad, who lived north of Clovis, wanted to date and see my mom in West Fresno, which was over 5 miles from the place. And, you know, he worked during the day. So he got a Caucasian friend of his to drive him to West Fresno, and he was in the back seat covered with a blanket. Those orders were upheld by the Supreme Court in the Gordon Hirabayashi and Minya Sui cases on the grounds of military necessity. Fred Korematsu challenged the exclusion orders that said that people on the West Coast had to leave the West Coast. And his case went against him. Justice Hugo Black deferred to the military orders and said that because the military thought there was a military necessity to remove the Japanese Americans from the West Coast, that the court should not stand in the way. Justice Stone, in dissent, said that this decision would lay about like a loaded gun to be used against other groups in the future. And Justice Murphy characterized the court's decision as justifying racism. There was another case brought by Mitsui Endo from Sacramento. She was a teacher, and she was already interned at War Relocation Center, and she challenged the continued detention by a writ of habeas corpus. And rather than decide the constitutional issues, the Supreme Court determined that certain leave provisions should not be followed. You couldn't go to a community that had anti-Japanese sentiment as not being part of the military necessity. And one day after the War Department terminated the internment program, the Supreme Court said that Mitsui Endo and others who were admittedly loyal could leave. It really had no practical effect since it was a day after the military had already decided to terminate the program. When we talk about immigration these days, we talk about family separation. So let me make a few comments about that. My clock has just gone off. I can't see it now. Anyway, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, a lot of the leaders in the Japanese American community were rounded up and taken God knows where. A lot of families didn't even know where usually the father was taken and was gone for a long period of time before reunification, if at all. Dave Masamoto, who is a local author that many of you know, has a new book out, Secret Harvest a hidden story of separation and the resilience of a family farm. And he talks about his aunt, Shizuko Masamoto, who had a mental disability. And when the internment orders came out, she was not with the family. And so the family never really found out where she was, not for 70 years, but before she died, the families reunited, which was a very nice thing that happened to them, but some families never did reunite. My family's experience was a little bit different. It was actually keeping the families together. So the Kedas lived in Clovis area and were not ordered to report. They were left to harvest their crops and then later sent to post in Arizona. And that's where my dad would normally have gone. But because of the exigencies of imminent removal, he and my mom decided to get married, and the Keda family reported to the Fresno Fairgrounds, the Fresno Assembly Center, with my mom's family, the Arase family. So that was one way that the two families were able to stay together. They later were sent to Jerome War Relocation Center in Arkansas. One of my favorite stories about my dad relates to Battle of Champions. Family structure broke down. Kids no longer ate with their families. The teenagers went off with their friends. And in Jerome, some of the teenagers started running roughshod on the camp. And the older Nisei, in their 20s, like my dad, they got together and said, we got to stop this. So there was a meeting of the two groups, and the decision was each side would pick a champion, a representative, and whoever won this fight, they would be the dominant group. And my dad was a pretty good sumo wrestler. The kid he was fighting was quite a bit bigger than him. But my dad used his sumo technique, picked him up, shoved him down, and the fight was over in less than a minute. The other guy gave up. So order was restored. I have a number of storyboards over there, and I believe they are on display. The theme of both memorials is really about the American dream. The Issei, first generation who immigrated to America, sought a better life. Many of them men were hoping they would make their fortunes and go back to Japan. That didn't happen, and then they started having families, picture brides, and so forth. And so they were pursuing the American dream, even though that dream was sort of denied to the Issei. They couldn't own land, they couldn't intermarry amongst the races, and so forth. They couldn't become naturalized citizens, but they did the best they could. So that was sort of the common with a number of immigrant groups. And then it goes, the storyboards go through the story of internment and the Japanese American soldiers, the fight for redress, an apology from the government. And ultimately, our last storyboard is the dream renewed, the American dream being renewed, and the success of Japanese Americans over the years. So we'll be going through some of those storyboards. One of them, storyboard 1, Our Lives Interrupted, starts with the Masada family. And Marion Masada, would you wave your hand or stand up? We're over here. Marion is part of that story, and her husband Saburo Masada, who became a reverend, is sort of center to that story. He remembers looking forward to going to the West Coast relays and instead being picked up in an Army truck with his family and taken to the Fresno Fairgrounds. He saw the banners for the West Coast relays and thought, how could this be happening in America? The Masada family is part of a story that I refer to as the good, the bad, and the ugly. So part of that was going to the internment sites. And then on storyboard 3, there's a good story about the Sorensen family who helped the Masada family by looking after their ranch, their farm. So after the war, the Masadas were able to come back and their ranch was intact, well taken care of, and they could get on with their lives. The ugly was not too long after they came back, after the war, after the Nisei soldiers had proven their Japanese-American loyalty on the battlefield, some guys in a pickup drove by their house and shot a 22 into their house. Could have hurt somebody. But even after the war, there was this anti-Asian sentiment. Another good story is also referenced in storyboard 3. It's about the Charles Pashayan and the Min Omada families. And Charles Pashayan was an insurance agent. He didn't know much about farming, but Min was his friend. They went duck hunting together, were in the same blind. On New Year's Day, the Omadas would invite the Pashayans over for sushi and sashimi and all of these gojiso, Japanese delicacies. And so they entered into an oral agreement, which is not enforceable under California law. Contracts regarding real property has to be in writing. And the agreement was Min would sell the ranch to Charles for $1, and when they came back, Charles would sell it back for $1. And that's what happened. The Omada family got their farm back. And there's another part to the story that's important. Years later, in the 70s, into the 80s, the Japanese American community sought redress for this wrong to their community. And what happened was a redress bill, Civil Liberties Act, was proposed. And there was a lot of resistance because there was a call for monetary compensation. At one time, $25,000 per person intern was sought. It was ultimately reduced to $20,000. And when you think about detention for nearly 3 years, what is that worth? Your business is lost, your farm may be lost. If you're a student, you can't continue your education except through leave program. And so that was the economic loss, but the loss of your freedom. You thought you were an American and you had these rights. Now they were taken away. What is that worth? In any event, Charles Pashayan had a son, Chip. And Chip was friends with the Omada children. And Chip became a congressman from the Valley. And he was a Republican. And he became the first Republican co-sponsor of the redress bill. And he later became a member of our committee for the different memorials. And I asked him at breakfast one time, Chip, there's been a lot of speculation. Why did you decide to sign on to the bill? And he said, well, I'm an attorney, and it was clearly unconstitutional. I knew it firsthand. So that is a wonderful story of bipartisanship, that civil rights and human rights is not a partisan issue. I need to move on, though. I have a lot on the Nisei soldiers, so let me go to that. There were over 30,000 Japanese Americans who served in the military during World War II. That's a high percentage of those who lived in America at the time. Over 700 of them came from the Valley. And we had a wonderful program, a Congressional Gold Medal ceremony. Congress, I think pretty much unanimously in both the House and the Senate, conferred the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor that the Congress can bestow, upon the Nisei soldiers. And let me see if I can find that. Here you see about 100 plus Nisei soldiers or surviving spouses or representatives of the family. And two of them that were represented were killed in action, received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Joe Nishimoto and Kazuo Otani. We're very proud of them. And we also have a memorial at the, oops, what happened? Somebody's going to need to help me, I think. Anyway, there is a list of those killed in action during World War II and other wars at the, yeah, thank you. At the Nisei War Memorial at Roding Park. I did it again. I guess I went too far. Looks like, anyway, maybe you can do it for me. Yeah. There. So there's the War Memorial, and we recognize our veterans every Memorial Day, and you're welcome to attend. It's at Roding Park. Let me say something about some of the individuals involved. Let me talk about Jay Shiroyama of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They rescued, he was part of the group that rescued the Lost Battalion. 121 men of the Texas Regiment were surrounded by Germans in the latter part of the war. Two other groups, American soldiers, tried to rescue them unsuccessfully. So the 442nd was called in. And after 5 days of brutal fighting, the I Company was the first to reach the Texans. The 442nd suffered over 800 casualties to rescue 121 men, the Texas Regiment. Jay Shiroyama was one of the 8 in I Company that reached the Lost Battalion. So normally a company has 100 or more men, and only 8 were left. Another story is of Harold Budena, a little further up the road, Fremont in Alameda County. He was interned at the start of the war, but later Japanese Americans were permitted to join the military and later were subject to the draft. In any event, Harold Budena represents the military intelligence service. For 50 years, their stories were largely untold. They were interpreters, translators, interrogators. So remember the context. Japanese Americans were suspect and ultimately interned because they were considered disloyal or possible spies or saboteurs. And here, Harold Fudena was a translator in the Pacific Theater. And the Navy got intelligence that Admiral Yamamoto, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, would be flying from point A to point B, but they didn't know when. And they really wanted to shoot him down. The leader of the attack on Pearl Harbor, what could be more symbolic and substantive? And Harold Fudena was the one who translated the Japanese intercept that pinpointed the time when Admiral Yamamoto would arrive at point B and his plane was shot down. So here, a Japanese American intern because of the Empire of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was the one who provided the important link that brought down the mastermind of the attack on Pearl Harbor. That episode is actually documented in a Valley PBS documentary called Unbroken Honor. So if you go to Valley PBS and search Unbroken Honor, you'll find out about that story and more. And the Masada story, I forgot to mention, is also part of a Valley PBS documentary, Silent Sacrifices. And Marian and Reverend Masada are heavily featured in there. And they were present at the regional Emmys in San Francisco when Silent Sacrifices received the Emmy for the best long documentary. That must have been quite an experience, Marian. Yeah. Lieutenant Khan Tagami, he was raised down the street in Selma, about 20 minutes from here. And he was military intelligence service. He ended up being the interpreter for General MacArthur during the occupation of Japan. And he became the intermediary or liaison with the Emperor of Japan, Emperor Hirohito, who was permitted to remain as a figurehead after the war. And General MacArthur asked Lieutenant Tagami to deliver a message to Emperor Hirohito. He would be getting inquiries from the Western press, and as the leader of his country, at least figuratively, it was totally up to him whether or not he wanted to grant an interview. The military was not requiring him to do that. And as Lieutenant Tagami turned to leave, the emperor spoke to him and said, I want to thank you and the Nisei soldiers. You've served as a bridge between our two countries. And I mentioned that story when I became Honorary Consul of Japan, because in my mind, the Nisei soldiers not only helped win the war, they also helped establish a lasting peace by promoting understanding between the two countries that lasts to this day. And in fact, my consulate in San Francisco is helping to host the APEC summit where Xi Jinping and President Biden will be meeting, I think, tomorrow. So fighting to preserve your rights are important, but also using diplomacy to further the aims of both sides are important. How's my time? Okay. Let me talk about Hiyoshi Emoto because he was part of the 522nd Artillery Battalion. I know his daughter Judy Brown. Some of you may know her. She was a escrow officer. And it ties in with Temple Beth Israel and the Jewish community. We had a great ceremony here to celebrate the 522nd and Chuni Sugihara, who I'll mention soon. The 522nd was detached from the 100th Battalion of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and was part of the spearhead attack into Germany. And as they fought, they came across a subcamp of the Dachau concentration camp. They were ordered not to enter until medical supplies and medical personnel could arrive, because the word was starting to get out about the terrible conditions in those camps. And when they saw the suffering, they shot off the lock, contrary to their orders, and gave what aid they could. Judy said her dad talked about just the stench of the place. You can imagine. Chuni Sugihara, so I mentioned him. We've had some programs here. Back in 1995, we had an event here, and Hiroki and Yukiko Sugihara participated in it. Talk about another great act of mercy by Chuni Sugihara, who was the Consul General of Japan in Lithuania. He was in Vilnius, the capital, and Jews, mainly from Poland, went from embassy to embassy seeking a way out of Lithuania and a way to escape the Holocaust. The U.S. Embassy turned them down. All of the embassies turned them down. Finally, they went to Japan, an ally of Germany, who was the perpetrator of these horrible crimes. And Chuni Sugihara, in discussions with his wife and even his children, came to the conclusion that humanity dictated that he help these people. And he issued over 6,000 travel visas to Japan. So that got him into China, and then some other members of the diplomatic corps permitted them, against the orders of Japan, the Japanese government, to get on a boat and go to Japan, from which they could later move on and avoid the Holocaust. 6,000. So that was over twice, I think close to 3 times the number of Jews saved by Schindler in the movie Schindler's List. But that was something great, and I'm proud to be associated with the Consular Corps of Japan in that regard. I mentioned the legal cases. I wanted to mention the Quorum Nobis cases in the 80s, a group of attorneys led by Peter Irons and Dale Manami, whom I've met. Dale's a friend at this point, who relitigated the cases of Fred Korematsu, Minya Sui, and Gordon Hirabayashi, who had challenged these orders in the 40s. Well, so much later, time had passed, memories had gone, but they found documentation that showed that the Department of Justice had failed to disclose information that would exculpate the Japanese Americans from these charges of possible espionage or sabotage. Some of the attorneys were in their 20s, and they were afraid, what if we lost these cases a second time? That would be so awful. But they proceeded, and they were able to get the criminal convictions vacated. They're hoping that the cases would be appealed up to the Supreme Court and have the original Supreme Court decisions overruled. But the government, having lost the cases, didn't want to take it up further. So those cases really remain on the books. There was the Muslim travel ban case that could have resulted in overturning the Korematsu decision. And Justice John Roberts said that the Korematsu decision had been overruled in the court of history. Well, that's not really legalese for saying that is no longer good law. And Justice Sonia Sotomayor said that in upholding this travel ban, you are doing the same thing that the courts did during World War II. You're deferring to the executive branch to tell us what was then called military necessity, now called national security, and upholding this racist decision. So I've had a debate with Don Tamaki, who was on that team, whether or not the Hawaii case overturned the Korematsu decision. He takes the position, well, it's basically overturned. I mean, just as Robert said, overturned in the court of history. And I contend it's still on the books. They have not officially overturned the Korematsu decision. Anyway, one of the good things, how are we doing? Okay, a couple things to wrap up. Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was passed. Ronald Reagan signed it. And it provided token monetary payments of $20,000 to internees and those whose constitutional rights were violated. It also provided the educational trust fund and an apology. And so there's an apology letter at the end of the storyboards. The Dream Renewed. Yeah, I'm sorry, there you go. Show one more. Oh, I did it again. The Dream Renewed is the last storyboard. And we show some of our community members who we are so proud of. Senator Daniel Inouye receiving the Medal of Honor from President Clinton. Secretary Norm Mineta receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President George W. Bush. Both of them were on our advisory committee for our projects. General Shinseki, who I've worked with on the National Veterans Network. Imagine, his father was classified 4C, enemy alien, after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And here he rose to the top spot in the Army as Chief of Staff of the Army. And then later he was appointed Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And what I found interesting was President-elect Obama nominated him on December 7, 2008, the 67th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It also has a picture of Congressman Bob Matsui and his wife, Doris, who later took his spot as a congresswoman. Doris was actually born in Dinuba, not far from here. And I take some liberties in saying this doesn't deserve being on the storyboard, but my dad, Ifumi Ikeda, served on the Clovis Veterans Memorial District Board from 1959 to 1976. To my knowledge, he is the first Asian American elected to public office in Fresno County. 25 years later, I became the first Asian American judge the Fresno County Superior Court. Of course, Judge Anthony Ishii went on the federal bench before me, and Judge Mikio Uchiyama was a municipal justice court judge and municipal court judge before me. I think I will wrap up, even though I have some other things, but just to give you sort of an overview of some of the stories in the Valley and beyond that relate to the Japanese American experience during World War II. And if we have some time, I'm happy to take some questions. You can clap.
Ideas for questions. I have some that I could
All right.
From my research for this project, we've learned that in most of the West Coast, only about 18% of Japanese Americans returned after the war, whereas for Fresno County, about 44% returned. I was wondering if you could give me an idea or your opinion on maybe some of the aspects that more of them return here.
That's a good question. It's somewhat speculative, but I've seen some information that really race relations in Fresno County and Central Valley were, for the most part, positive. And I've told you the story of the Sorensen family and the Pashayan family, and those are not unique. And I think relations were better. Part of it is because we're in a farming community. And anyone who's been in farming knows you have to work together if you're farmers, because tractors break down, a load turns over, you need help repairing something, or you may need to tow something. And your neighbors are the glue that makes it possible for folks in the farming community to get along. And whether that sort of teamwork goes on throughout the community, it's hard to say, but at least from my perspective, I think that's one explanation. Farmers, they don't care if you're Armenian or if you're Italian or whatever. We got to work together. Anyone else? I'm keeping you from the refreshments. They look pretty good. I guess I had an idea to close. Oh, okay, go ahead. I'd say it's pretty positive. Yeah, we had the West Fresno community. We call it Chinatown, but a lot of Japanese businesses were there. And I think folks like being able to get fresh fish at Central Fish, or there was another fish market there. Yeah. When you know each other, that makes a big difference. And that's why diplomacy is so important. I'm a member of our Fresno Kochi Sister Cities Committee, and we've got a bunch of sister cities, France, Italy, Armenia, and so forth. And the idea there, which was started by President Eisenhower, was that people lived together, knew each other. They would see that there's more that binds us than divides us. And you don't go to war against your friends. So I've supported the Sister Cities program. I believe diplomacy is part of that formula. We need more of it, not less. Yes. No, it's true of the 442 and the 100th Battalion. The Those were the 3,000 men from Hawaii who started um, the war effort for Japanese American soldiers. But as I was saying, the military intelligence service was very important, and those soldiers served in the Pacific Theater. My uncle, who was drafted before Pearl Harbor, eventually went into the military intelligence service, and he was a translator in the China-Burma theater. And he was actually assigned to a Chinese group. But as I said, for 50 years, their story was largely untold. So I like to tell some of those stories. My dad was in the MIS, so was my wife's dad, Reggie Shikami. They were drafted later part of the war and ended up serving in the occupation of Japan. I think those soldiers did a lot to improve relations, and this was generally the soldiers, American soldiers. They saw the devastation of Japan after the war, and they provided food and candy and tried to be nice to the folks, especially the kids. Really breaks your heart to see kids suffering. And I remember my dad, when he'd talk about the occupation, he would just break out in tears. I mean, he just couldn't talk about it. It was so heartbreaking, especially when it came to the conditions for the kids. Japan was devastated. And thank God we had the Marshall Plan, both in Germany and in Japan. You know, they were our enemy, but we brought them back to life. There's been a strong bond ever since. And that's good policy. Making your enemy your friend. Finding out areas of common interests. We have no better friend in the Pacific than Japan. That's my belief. Yes. Dr. Kapoor, thank you for honoring us with your presence. Dr. Kapoor has done so much. I'd like to give him a hand for all of his work. Part of that includes the Hiroshima and Nagasaki Remembrance Days. He and I started the first one at Fresno State with the planting of the peace trees from Hiroshima. The tree survived the bomb blast, nuclear bomb on August 6, 1945. And saplings and these trees have been planted all over the world to represent hope for a more peaceful world. And, you've stood for peace all your life, Dr. Kapoor. Thank you. It was an honor to work with you on that project, and I'm glad that it's continuing on. Paula Kanagawa is part of the group that's kept that going. You know, they folded 1,000 cranes. Do you know how long that takes to fold 1,000 cranes? It'd take me 20 minutes to fold one, but of course they're much better than me. Anyway. think a lot of healing has taken place, but when you go back to the 70s when JCL started its redress campaign, there was a division in the Japanese American community. Was this a good idea? A lot of people thought, let sleeping dogs lie. You know, we're doing pretty well. If we bring this up, we might get anti-Asian sentiment stirred up again. And those were memories we'd just as soon forget. Before we got to the legislation, JCL, in conjunction with the Big Four, Senator Inoue, Sparky Senator Matsunaga, Congressman Matsui, and Congressman Mineta met, and Senator Inoue said, well, if you're going to try to go for compensation, you better start with a commission. Figure out what the facts are, let an independent commission come up with recommendations. And it was not a popular decision. You know, it was like, go for broke. Let's go for it. And if we don't get it, at least we gave it a good shot. People are dying, you know, our first generation are getting old and they're dying off. We went with the commission. Part of the healing was the community actually finding its voice and telling their stories. And what was interesting was these Issei and Nisei men who were very stoic usually. They didn't show a lot of emotion. Families had never seen some of these men cry. Not at a death in the family, not in tragedy, but as they told their stories, pretty much to the person, they broke down. It was hard for them to finish their stories. And that really galvanized the Japanese American in supporting the redress effort. And I think it started the healing process. And when the Civil Liberties Act was passed, that was such a great accomplishment. Less than 0.5% of the population by ethnicity in getting major civil rights legislation passed. But it wasn't just through JACL or the various Japanese American organizations that supported it. The Jewish Anti-Defamation League, Barney Frank, who was Jewish, a gay man, was the chairman of the subcommittee on government relations that had jurisdiction. He pushed it along. NAACP, the whole civil rights community decided we're going to make this our priority. So it just shows the power of collaboration and working together. So I think it's gone a long way. My dad never, or my mom, never expressed any bitterness. I did have an uncle, Jack, who was bitter for a long time. And if I may just spend a minute to tell this story, maybe it'll help. On his 21st birthday, he was on a train from Portland, Oregon to Pinedale Assembly Center. The folks at Pinedale weren't from the Valley. Those people went to the Fresno Fairgrounds. They were from Sacramento, Washington, and Oregon, about 4,300, or 4,700. I think there were 5,300 at the fairgrounds. He arrived in July. He came from a cool climate. And he said, I thought I arrived in hell. It was so damn hot. We had metal bedposts. They sank into the asphalt, the blacktop. It was so hot, it just sank. If you drop clothes, it'd get blackened with this tar. He thought he had arrived in hell, and he was bitter for many, many years. And we're trying to get support for the Pinedale Assembly Center Memorial in Congress. Jim Costa, Congressman Costa was a good friend. He supported it. He said, I'll propose a resolution. Can you give me some stories, that talks about what this experience was like, why we need to support a memorial so that people remember this experience. And one of those was a letter from Uncle Jack, and he talked about this experience. And as it turned out, when Congressman Costa gave his remarks, he read from Uncle Jack's letter. And at a ceremony later, we asked Jack to come, and he was from Southern California, dress up. His family came. We got a little surprise. And so Congressman Costa presented Jack with a plaque, which had his Congressman Costa's comments about Jack and his experience. And he thanked him, along with maybe 3 or 4 others whose stories were shared. And he thought that was pretty great. And started to think, well, maybe the government really does know that what the government did was wrong. And from what I've heard, he sort of reconciled himself. And I would hope that a lot of Japanese Americans would. If I may, one of the stories is about the resistors of conscience. Within the Japanese American community, there's still wounds to heal. And one of those relates to those Japanese Americans who were interned, were drafted into the military, and then on principle said, we will not serve until our rights are restored as citizens. That means release us, release our families. And they ended up going to prison for their beliefs. But, we Japanese Americans, we're so proud of our Nisei soldiers. And a lot of the soldiers thought, you are disloyal. You're not proving Japanese Americans can be trusted. And there was this division, not just between the resistors, but and the soldiers, but within the community generally. JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, had supported soldiers fighting for America. And so, unfortunately, JACL has been criticized for not embracing the principled stand that these resistors of conscience took. But I think that too is starting to heal. JACL has apologized, saying that under the circumstances, people took principled positions, and we should respect that and honor it and get past it. And I think that's what we need to do as a community. And it's a good thing to say generally. That's what we have to do. Sometimes we don't agree with policies that people take. We have to get past it. People have their perspectives. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, but move on. Let's make progress.
Thank you so much. So much.
Okay.
I think the mic is cutting us short. So I guess it's probably about time that we go over across the hall. The community center has been filled with art pieces from McLean High School, thanks to Mark Patterson and his students, that depict what Mr. Ikeda has been telling us about. There is also some newspaper clippings that have been pulled, and then Mr. Ikeda's storyboards are also pulled. And feel free to mingle. There is some snacks from the United Japanese Christian Church. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming today. And thank you again, Ms. Officer.
One other thing, thank you. At the back table, I've put out a few things for you to look at. One is the Congressional Gold Medal. It's a replica in bronze, and it has a program from our medal ceremony here in Central Cal. And also there are stamps. The Nisei soldiers were honored by US postage stamp. So feel free to take a look at those too. Thank you all very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Sorry about the slide.